Well, Kevin, can you believe this is the 100th episode of Let's Go to Space Blue Sky Learning?
No, and it seems like it was 2 years and 1 month ago we started.
And I know it is that long, but it doesn't seem like that to me. It seems like we just began. So basically, when we started this podcast, we had just kind of come up with the idea of how we were going to be able to separate what you were doing with students at the school that we were both working at into kind of an after school program. I mean, it was kind of necessitated in some respects by COVID, but at the same time, we could sense that there was something that needed to be available for students at no matter what school they were at to be able to participate in, this real world aerospace that you're doing. So this episode, of course, as you know, is devoted to what has taken place since we first started this podcast, which is kind of the beginning of what we lovingly, refer to as the Aerospace and Innovation Academy. It's our after school program where we work with students in both the Wolfpack CubeSat development team and Space Club. But we do so much more than that. So for our listeners today, where would you like to start off as we recap kind of these last few years since we started the podcast?
Well, I think we should probably just start with podcasts themselves, since we had a very good year with podcasts.
Yeah, I love the fact that we've made it to 100. We started off originally, we were just kind of posting randomly whenever we got done with one. And then we were doing it kind of bi-weekly, but then really quickly, we kind of got to a groove where we were able to do it weekly. So we're kind of up there along with most, I want to hasten to say real podcasts, but we're dropping weekly.
Right. And I would add that what was interesting last year is we literally spent 4 weeks out of the country. Well, 3 weeks out of the country and 1 week in Hawaii. So that was, that's always more difficult to keep your podcasts, do your interviews when you're obviously not at home and in different time zones from perhaps the people you want to interview.
No, and I think that's one of the things that we learned, right? So like for me, we had to learn how to use the podcast software. We use Anchor, by the way. And once, our first ones, if you were watch the YouTube, like the podcast, we don't even have our little background going on. It was kind of like super generic and we learned along the way. But now, we've kind of navigated through changes even in the software. We have a nifty background.
And for our entertainment value for our audience, we still have a really nice microphone that we never figured out
how to use. It
just sits behind the tarp.
It's true. It's
collecting dust.
And even a video, like we actually have a camera as well. Gifts that we got. But what I was trying to get to is that what we did in that amount of time is we got smart enough to batch, right? And so that really allowed us to do several podcasts over the course of a smaller time frame and set them up to drop. So that was helpful for while we were gone.
I like the fact that when we interact with people at conferences or in our networking, it is a great way to continue to develop a relationship with someone by simply spending a half hour interviewing them. Over the past year, we had a really diverse range of folks. We had, at a minimum, just without even looking at my list, I know we had some really great college students of different ages. We had some physicists, some engineers. We had a number of students from all ages that we work with and students we have yet to work with. We would meet interesting people at conferences, even from other countries. The lady from the Netherlands really stands out. That was a great podcast. And the gentleman that wrote the code for the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars. And we could just go on. And then we have crowd favorites like Chelsea Partridge is always been a favorite of mine. She's a Lockheed Martin engineer that works on the Orion. So I thought the podcasts were a great way to bring different perspectives, different viewpoints about education and different backstories to our audience.
Well, two things I want to say about what you've listed an impressive assortment, right, of guests. But I think too, back to some of the most memorable ones, I think to the person who started the Big Red Sat, and how he's no longer with us since then.
John McClure.
John McClure started that. And we had several interviews with people who were participating in that CubeSat. Since his passing, of course, that satellite has launched, and we've been able to continue that even into this year.
It's not launched yet, but they were definitely selected by NASA. So the very first satellite chosen by the CubeSat Launch Initiative from Nebraska is a direct result of this man, John McClure, that we met in 2019 at the Michigan Space Forum, who was impressed with a couple of our students that he met before I ever met him. And that sort of was the beginning. So it was a great story. I'm sorry he's gone, but his legacy is there because I believe his grandchildren, at least one or two of them, are on that Big Red Sat team.
Well, I think that would be the genesis of, we had several spinoffs from that podcast with different people who are working on that team. So yes. I would think that was the catalyst, the Big Red Sat, really, as far as the most podcasts based on one of the themes. But we've also started, now we've gotten to the point where we're actually doing some revisits. In other words, like, projects that we did early on that we're kind of touching base with people now, one of which is, of course, the Mars lunar rover, was episode 2, I believe.
It was very early on. It was Owen and Caden.
It might have been episode 3 now that I'm thinking about it, but still very early.
And what's interesting is I believe they were both in high school the first time we interviewed them. And now one's at UCF and one's at UF.
Well, and we just did an update, as a matter of fact. So episode right before this, 99, was an update rather on that lunar rover. So wait, just let me be clear on our date. So we started this in December of 2020. Is that right?
Correct.
And it's now like February, barely, of 2023.
So it was the end of December. So really all of 21, all of 22, and basically about 5 weeks on top of that.
Well, that's a lot of podcasts. I have to say, out of all the things that we do with students at the Aerospace and Innovation Academy, the podcast for me is something that I really enjoy. It was a skill set that, I listen to a lot of podcasts personally. So to be able to do one, it was like a learning, there was growth for me, but it's something I enjoy.
Well, interestingly, the podcast was a spinoff of some of our other after school activities. But we have a young lady who's a fantastic artist and writer who literally takes the podcasts periodically. She does research and writes these wonderful blog entries.
Well, we did a podcast with Amanda, as a matter of fact, about how it is that she does, how she was able to take something. She's not like the sciencey engineering side. She prefers the more artsy side, although she is a science.
I'd like to talk about Amanda in context of what we put together. Starting last spring, I started working with an engineer from Jacobs up at Kennedy Space Center by the name of Kevin Johnson. He, we
podcasted Kevin Johnson.
That's right. Like we are, he is an officer in the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He's the current president of the Cape Canaveral section. So he and I started planning this conference. I really wanted to do a conference, and he came along and was a really great help. And we organized this wonderful conference, our very first conference at Kennedy Space Center in October. And Amanda was actually a really important part of the conference because we had an art contest for children. Yeah. Not only did she help me score the entries, but she actually helped me write the rubric and the rules that we were able to distribute. So we were able to give out 2 prizes, a senior division and a junior division. And we had first, second, and third in both. And it was fantastic. And so that it was actually a way that a young lady who contributed in ways that you just wouldn't imagine that would be the case.
I think when I think back to some of the earlier episodes of the podcast, right, we have as you mentioned, some diverse people, but I'm thinking back to like our policy interviews, right? We had Dale Ketchum of Space Florida. We also had, I believe, our representative, Congressman Brian Mast was on about legislation that he worked with our own students. And then later we talked about space law. So the idea of how we've taken the elements that we kind of embrace with entrepreneurship and policy and engineering. And when we found their ways into our podcast as well. So like the Michelle Hanlon podcast episode about space law was fantastic for me.
Actually, that's episode 86. That is a really good one. And you forgot one policy. One of my all-time favorite podcasts was Frank DeBello.
Oh, no, I hadn't forgotten him. I just didn't list him as Space Florida. He was another one.
He's the director of Space Florida. And so knowledgeable, right? He's got probably 40 years of aerospace experience.
Well, it comes at a time as we're recording this podcast that we're about to head back to Tallahassee for Space Day. After COVID, it's back face to face. So, while we're not going with Space Florida this year, that's really where we got our start, why we were even able to take kids up to Tallahassee to do that. So,
right. We've done advocacy. That's another thing we continue to do during COVID. Prior to COVID, we would go to Tallahassee with what we'd like to call our junior varsity kids, and they were actually 6th graders. And A few fifth, but mostly sixth and seventh graders. And then when they cut their teeth on doing real policy, then we would have what we called the varsity trip. And we would take the seventh, eighth graders, and sometimes ninth grade or high school students to call on Congress. And our goal was to call on all 29 Florida congressional offices.
Right. Well, since we've talked a little bit about podcasts, let's pivot a little bit to policy as we're there now. So we did it face to face prior to COVID. We continued even during COVID to meet both in Tallahassee and DC. You're a person who was representing like the AIAA, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, to kind of set these congressional visits day up. So as a person who's responsible for the state of Florida in that, why is advocacy for the aerospace industry so important anyway?
Well, I could be, let's be candid. Sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And often if my limited view and experience of grassroots advocacy is, if you're not there in the ear of the politician explaining the importance, sometimes it's easier to maybe cross out a line item. And I can give you a specific example. I got started in advocacy because our good friend, J.D. Mukherjee, Florida Space Grant Director.
Also podcasted.
One of our good podcasts, yes. He had given me a grant years ago, and he said, Kevin, I'd like you to come to D.C. because every year Congress only gives us half of the budget we need. And then we have to go there. And I think he's told the story as if the space grant directors around the country had to beg and cajole Congress to get the budget up to just where they operated, where they needed to operate. So I said, well, hey, instead of just me going, can I take one of my students? And sure enough, taking a young student to talk about the importance of the Space Grant Consortium was great. And that's how it all got started for me in 2006.
Well, it's funny. So since that amount of time, obviously we took people face to face, then we were online, and now we're taking a brand new cohort of students up just next weekend. As a matter of fact, I want to go back to the JD Mukherjee interview. That's one of the funniest memories we have. Another lesson learned: hit the record button. We had to re-record.
We actually, yes, we had 2 interviews with him, but only one got recorded. And but he is such a good soul. And you talk about somebody who really genuinely invests and cares about education. That's JD. And if you want to find him, he is a professor at the University of Central Florida, and he is the state lead for the Space Grant Consortium.
Well, before we move past him, I want to also mention that, he helped us with some work that we were trying to do to get grants for teachers for a camp that we had run for a while. But now, as we're kind of moving into Space Day, we're looking at how else we can make these kind of changes. And while he gave us grants to reach out to teachers, one of the things our policy students now is trying to do is like to develop his own long-term project. So since we're still talking about advocacy, we have to mention Michael McCarty, who from his experience on these advocacy trips, realized that not everybody has the opportunities that the students that we work with often get. So tell us a little bit about the appropriations that he's working on that we're hoping to get some sponsorship.
Sure. Well, let me give you a very short 30-second background on Michael McCarty. I first met Michael when he was an incoming 6th grader. He was in my class, my academic class, and my aerospace elective, and I think he was in your debate as well. Yeah. Very enthusiastic, willing to learn. He's stubborn at times, but he went to the International Astronautical Congress as a 6th grader when it was in Washington, D.C. prior to COVID. And then even during COVID, he led our space settlement design team for a couple of years. We had been world champions in that. That's a tough competition, but he had led that. He worked really hard on his soft skills and his academics. And Mike's passion project, his sort of thing he really wants to focus on is real world advocacy that leads to real legislation or policy changes. Mm-hmm. So his current effort, what he's working on right now is he is supporting something that I really believe in, which is how do we get skills training to folks who are most in need of it? Those that could, if they had some skills training, then they might be eligible to qualify to get some of these entry-level jobs in aerospace companies.
You mean like trade programs or certificate programs?
Correct, like 2-year degree programs or skills. You think about electronics, welding, plumbing, those there's a continuum of skills, right? Mm-hmm. There's one kind of electronics person that may come and work in your home, but if you're working on missiles or drones or spacecraft or jets, that's an entirely different level, and those are really great paying jobs, but they are skilled.
Well, no, I know he's excited about doing that. And it's something that he'll be able to put on a resume that will really help him to stand out as he gets to college.
Michael is doing exactly what we want all of our Wolfpack students to do, which is to find
Aerospace and Innovation Academy students through Space Club.
Is to find an area that you love and that you want to do meaningful work in, and then just go as far and as deep as you can.
Well, and there's precedent set, right? Like we've worked with, as we mentioned earlier, Congressman Mass. We actually have had legislation in aerospace where our students got to work on that. So that's what we're trying to bring back. We've had some difficulty, COVID kind of slowed things down, but we'll see what happens from there. So that's something to be excited about as we move forward. I know you mentioned Michael had been part of some competitions that we've done. That's another big focus for the Aerospace and Innovation Academy. Can you recap some of the competitions that we've done since we got this podcast started?
Yes. So when you hear us, we refer to the Aerospace and Innovation Academy, which is our program that oversees all of our after school. We have that program. We have a 501c3 called the Wolfpack CubeSat Development Team, which is specifically focused on the satellites. And then we have my first company was Blue Cube Aerospace. Some of the older students that have worked with us for years find that they want to be very entrepreneurial and they want to continue doing aerospace or technology-based things. So this past year, we got involved with 3 or 4 different really neat things that were really the result of like a highly motivated student. So I'm thinking of Paul Kiesling. And Paul is up at Exeter right now,
whom we have podcasted.
And yes, he's been podcast as well. And he is very excited about a number of topics, but he submitted us for an invention for the Edison Invention Awards, and in the category of education and experiential learning. And we actually did win an Edison Award. And so we have gone, some students and I, we've gone for the past couple of years to the national award ceremony at Edison's winter home in Fort Myers. What's cool about that is the first year we went, that Samer El-Haushi, whom we've podcasted, co-I for his own CubeSat that flew last July. He and I were on a panel with Miles O'Brien. That was fun. And then last year we went, Dylan Kiesling and William Abel, both have been podcasted. They were a part of a student pitch fest at this big sort of national gathering. So
wait, isn't that also where your Miles O'Brien, then you met Kate Tobin, and we've also
Kate Tobin is a fantastic film producer. She's a writer, producer. She and Miles O'Brien, I believe, have worked together for 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah, it was a really fun podcast to listen to.
So if you see something very cool on PBS, like the DART mission, where we redirected an asteroid with a rocket collision, Kate Tobin produced and Miles O'Brien narrated these wonderful, rich science stories.
Well, that's one competition here, but I know that you have mentioned quite a few since we've...
Right. 2 more that were NASA related very quickly is we got involved thanks to Yasmin and Paul. Yasmin Shower is now a sophomore at the University of Florida. She's been with us for about a year, and she is definitely the oldest student that ever joined our team. We've had 10-year-olds, and then we had this Yasmin lady, young woman who was just on fire. And she and Paul and I worked on something called the NASA ISS, the International Space Station Sustainability Challenge. And it was actually sponsored, believe it or not, by L'Oreal.
Yeah, that was that hackathon that was happening at the same time as that conference.
Well, that's actually, no, that's different. Oh, that's another one. But the ISS Sustainability Challenge, we were looking at ways to reduce plastic and trying to remove some plastic from the environment. That was the problem we were tackling. We ended up getting, Paul actually earned a nice honorable mention for the work he had done on that. And then later, we were one of 7 companies selected by NASA for the iTech program. So we got to showcase and make a pitch to investors and NASA folks. It was a really great opportunity. The one you're referring to is what Yasmin led recently. We made it all the way to the finalists in the Global Space Sustainability Challenge. And that was an international competition. So we had American kids, our AIA students, and we had a student from the United Kingdom and a student from Switzerland. And we formed a team and we made it to the finals in our category. So I think out of about 140 teams, we made it to the finals in our category.
Now, don't you do something called Plant the Moon too? Because I know one of our students at one of the conferences, which I know we'll get to later, kind of talked about that. And I know that you're working on that now with current Space Club students, which it's like the early group, right?
Yes.
You get to Space Club, then you get to Wolfpack.
So yes, Plant the Moon Challenge is a wonderful competition. It's a great learning activity. There's a company called Exolith at the University of Central Florida, and they manufacture a lunar Highlands simulant. They also manufacture a Martian simulant, but the contest revolves around, can we augment this lunar simulant to grow foods that we could eat? And so the idea is eventually we're going to live on the moon. We need to grow food on the moon instead of trying to ship everything.
Isn't this the one where one of the students that we've also podcasted, Arnaf, came up with the idea of using human poop in order to grow some food in there? Or there was like
actually,
some bacteria
he was looking at bacteria to degrade waste for so that you could eat it again. So yeah. Now, what you may have, and you'll get this, we actually podcasted a young lady named Annalyn Connor, who is an engineer or she actually manufactures the Exolith. That's her job while she is an aerospace engineering student at the University of Central Florida.
Right. Well, it seems to me like those two could be related again. So I know that that's something you enter. Are there any other competitions that I am remiss in remembering for the last few years?
There is the single largest event that we do each year is that we apply to the NASA CubeSat launch initiative. And that is open to companies and museums and universities primarily have taken advantage of it as a way to win a free ride and launch and integration costs covered by NASA up to $300,000.
How is that a competition though? So you mean like you're all applying for a particular?
It's basically an RFP for you guys. That's a request for proposals that NASA sends out in early August. And then you have an early November deadline, and our goal is to write the best proposal such that we'll get selected by NASA.
Okay.
Now, our second proposal was co-investigator was Samer El-Haushi. He was a 7th grader. Today, he's an 11th grader, and I'm really proud of him because last summer, it was a tough road, especially during COVID and some other situations, but his CAPSAT launched in July of this past year to the ISS and was deployed.
So it seems like some of these competitions, and I know we're going to talk about some of how the research for these competitions ultimately can lend themselves to writing papers for conferences, but it seems like they can also become proposals for CubeSats. So I know that that would have been the second CubeSat that you were part of. The one that you mentioned was Samer, also podcasted. But now we are looking at a third and even a fourth. So tell me a little bit about, I think what will be the next one, which is the FlipSat, right? Because Theo started working on that.
Right. So our third mission to space with the students we work with, this idea was originated again by a middle school student who is now in high school, and he was turned down by NASA twice. So he was a part of 2 full proposals to NASA while he was in middle school. It's Theodore Ouyang, and I believe we podcasted him twice.
Absolutely, right. He might have been our first one that we did. Well, we did him so early.
He was our first interview was Theo and William, I believe. And
Theo and Samer, they both talked about
maybe,
yes.
Yeah. And so Theo's payload, we're getting ready to go integrate it. We had intended to integrate it last month, but we have a few issues. We're getting through them. But Theo is the principal investigator of the FlipSat mission, and he's looking at bit flips. And we're actually going to fly as a hosted payload in a device called the Troop hardware that is mounted onto an ESPA ring or a secondary ring that will be deploying lots of other satellites. So we'll stay attached to this device that sits on top of, let's say, a Falcon 9. And as this device starts kicking out satellites into space, Theo's mission will actually run from the ring. So this is a big deal for two reasons. Number one, student, principal, investigator. For the first two satellites, I was the PI and the students were the co-Is. Now Theo is the PI and I'm the co-I. And so that's a huge deal.
Well,
our fourth, let me just say about our
I
fourth
just wanted to say like the timeline though. So Theo started this and it's coming to fruition before you go on to the next one.
Yes. Theo had this idea when he was in the 7th and 8th grade and he was a co-I. He helped develop a full 90 to 100 page proposal.
Right. So he's been talking about it for 7, 8, 9. That's what, 4 years?
Right. And what has changed is that William Mayville, another one of our students,
wanted to go next. How's he funding it?
Who began with us, he and Theo began really with us in the 5th grade, and now they're in the 11th. William, his passion project is to create a philanthropy where he can help provide launch opportunities for deserving high school teams. Right.
So it sounds like, so Theo's wasn't necessarily selected by the CubeSat Launch Initiative, so there was an issue with funding. So one of our other students who has the interest in the entrepreneurship kind of side frame,
correct,
like basically said, well, we're going to solve this problem and created a funding mechanism. So Theo has the money now to launch his satellite. And it's not that his project isn't good, as we talked about in that podcast interview. It's just that the competition is pretty fierce, right?
Actually, we compete annually against MIT,
and universities,
Georgia Tech,
and he's still in high school, right?
Right.
So that's what's crazy about it.
On one hand, we'd like to win every year. On the other hand, we're competing against really, really good universities. So I'm very proud of that. We raised enough cash to cover the hardware. So I'm paying for the hardware out of the Wolfpack checking account, and William raised the money for the actual launch, the flight, the integration in the flight. So that's a huge win for 2 kids and our teams.
Well, so we've been mentioning all these kids as we've been going, and it's like a whirlwind to think about, but there are so many students who seem to have embraced the idea of taking something that they're interested in, kind of honing in on it, focusing it, using it in many different ways, but ultimately those products that they're producing are resume builders that are definitely helping them to stand out.
If I just, without even making a list, we have students that are writers, we have students that are authors and illustrators, we have program managers or project coordinators. We have kids that helped us with our own conferences. We have students that write technical papers. We have students that turn the wrenches and want to be builders. We have students that, well, I think our audience probably knows. I believe that whatever a student wants to do, we can find a home for that in space.
Yeah, well, that's really what we seek to do, right, at the Aerospace and Innovation Academy, is provide those unique and distinctive STEM opportunities. But you were about to mention the one that is also in the works, and I know we mentioned Paul earlier, but this one is related to that plastic that he had been investigating for a competition, right?
Right. We have been really focused on this certain type of bacteria called Ideonella sequensis, and it has 2 enzyme pathways that are really nice. They're designed, they have evolved to be able to degrade polyethylene tetraphthalate, or PET, which is a common single-use plastic ingredient. So what we're thinking is, let's take the genes out of the bacteria, or look at the bacteria, and let's compare the efficacy or the efficiency of that pathway in space, in free fall, around the Earth, and compare that to our ground studies. And we're looking at trying to create, think of it as a compost pile in space for long-term crewed space flights, where you can recycle your inorganic materials just as easily as you can your organic material.
Wait, could that break down the poop from Arnav's paper?
Well, actually, bacteria already do that. So you have, when you think about the classes of consumers, there are decomposers and there are also detritivores. And so, yes, those organisms would repurpose those organic materials. Complex macromolecules get broken down so that plants or other things could take in those things as nutrients then.
Well, yeah. So obviously CubeSats, it kind of got started with a CubeSat, and you're still doing CubeSats. You've just expanded into so many different things.
So our one single proposal, we had submitted up to 4 or 5 proposals in years past, but we only submitted one this year. It is, I think, a really good proposal, and we're awaiting NASA's announcement for that. But that's called the WolfSat-1, and that's our current proposal.
Now you have a student in the kind of like who's coming up, who's now thinking along the lines of their next CubeSat proposal.
Actually, we always try to crowdsource the best ideas. So you may have heard us use the phrase co-opetition. We collaborate and we compete. We want the best ideas to bubble up to the top, but in the end, we're just one team. So this year, our next satellite moving forward is by a young man named Colin Quinn, 9th grader, and he is very interested in galactic cosmic radiation and building, taking some sensors that otherwise are larger, but miniaturizing them so that we can put them in a CubeSat and get that CubeSat out to cislunar space, away from the Earth's, the safety of our magnetic fields, our magnetic field lines. The Van Allen radiation belts tend to, they protect everything underneath. So we're going to put the CubeSat out there in cislunar space, and that's the goal is to really do some space weather research out there beyond the Earth.
I just remember when he was using that ham radio, so he's always been interested in some ways of communication.
He is the very first one of our students that got his amateur radio license.
I know. Well, all right. For the sake of time, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of my favorite memories involving, travel and some extra.
Sure.
We've been able to, COVID was really good for us in that kids were able to start writing conferences. And since school wasn't really, kind of that looming behind us for attendance purposes, we were able to do a lot of conferences. So let's get a recap of that.
If I only look at 2022, let's back up to October 2021. The International Astronautical Congress was in Dubai, and that was a fantastic
trip. Oh my gosh.
The food, the people, just over the top, fantastic.
I never cared about going to Dubai. So I love Dubai.
So we were in Dubai, and I think we had about 10 or 11 kids and seemed like 9 presentations.
So many parents too came along. It was such a great trip.
It was a good trip.
To be able to be with, we are like a family, like all of us with the kids and their parents.
So we remember, the reason we travel is because the students wrote papers that were accepted. And then we had, I think we had about 11 papers accepted to a conference in Hawaii called the Hawaii International Conference on Education. Now we only ended up presenting 4 of them. And we had 5 students that made 4 presentations on the Big Island of Hawaii in January.
But don't forget, hardly anyone showed up to that conference because that was definitely affected by COVID.
Yes.
And we were looking around going, we're here.
It was a great, and what was nice about it is every one of those students, that was they
were brand new,
their first presentation in Hawaii and on the Big Island. I highly recommend it for educators. It's the first week in January. It's in Oahu now for the next couple of years. So, in Honolulu. So what a horrible way to spend your winter break,
Right.
So after Hawaii, the next conference we had was, there was a conference in Atlanta called AbSciCon, or it was basically astrobiology. And so we had 4 students present there, 2 papers, one was virtual and one was live. And again, the kids that presented live, Santiago, I think that was his first conference.
Yeah, I think
I think it was Daniel's second.
Right, because he went to Hawaii.
Yeah, Daniel. Yeah. And so after Hawaii, let's see, I'm looking at my little cheat notes here. I think the next thing we did is I took a group of kids and we went to a high altitude balloon and hardware workshop in Indiana in the early part of summer. And so we went to we went there and we did a high altitude balloon. Out of all the balloons I've done over the years, seems like half a dozen with the kids. We've always sent them out and they've ended up in the Atlantic Ocean. Mm-hmm. This one we actually tracked down. We had to drive from Indiana into Ohio and drove past some interesting Amish communities, and all the corn everywhere was about.
Well, we've podcasted a lot of the near space launch.
Oh gosh, they're wonderful people. Well, so yes. And then I also gave a presentation in Washington, D.C. at the International Space Development Conference as a space ambassador with the NSS. And that was June, and that gets us to July, where we were
traveling overseas again.
We were gone for 2 weeks to the Committee for Space Research in Athens, Greece. We had at least 9 or 10 kids. I think we had 11 papers and at least 9 students there. Fantastic. Didn't have a bad meal in Italy or Greece for 2
Well, you
weeks.
say Italy. That's because we flew into Rome and
Yeah, there's no bad
got a little
food.
bit of pasta before we went. Great food in Greece too. Of course, the Mediterranean. You talk about ways to spend your work trips. Come on, but that's not. We weren't done there because right after that trip,
right after that, we went to. I went to Logan, Utah, to Small Sat conference with 5 students. It was Tafari, Celine, Yasmin, William, and Theo. It was the first time I'd ever gone with just high school kids to Small Sat. My previous 3 years, it had always been middle school kids. So that was very interesting.
Is that the one that Caden also went on? You guys had to track the
yes,
down
that
one
was,
you were just mentioning?
Caden went.
That's right.
No.
And no, that was different because that was the one to Logan, Utah. That was with Mike Makati.
Yes,
right, so
it was
these are not the same ones.
when I went to Indiana in June.
That was for the integration.
Yes.
Right, gotcha.
When I went to Indiana in June, we had the Makati brothers and we had the Vessios.
That's right.
And
that was just CubeSat stuff, but it's just they all run together because Small Sat's there in Logan.
So we're only in August now. We're only in August.
I'm exhausted reliving it.
And then of course a horrible week we had to spend in Paris, France.
Paris.
Yeah.
What do you recall? That was back. Listen, that was back at the IAC. So we started with the IAC in Dubai.
Yes.
We ended the IAC in Paris.
Yes. And what's sad is we had papers during COVID accepted in Australia and St. Petersburg,
and Russia. Yeah, we couldn't go.
And and Dubai. So it was originally IAC was supposed to be in Dubai in 2021.
So I have to say COVID was good because we could actually travel more now that we're back. Back in school, it's making it a little bit more difficult. We can't head out to necessarily the ones we want to do this year, but that's a pretty impressive list.
Right. The one I missed this year, I really wanted to go to was Singapore. There was a coast bar in Singapore about small sats in April. And honestly, we just couldn't swing it this year. We're really getting excited about coast bar.
You mean is April coming up?
Yes. Yeah. We could not get the papers submitted in time.
Well, we wouldn't have been able to travel. In fairness, we're also teachers, right? So we couldn't have left to do that.
I can tell you though that if you're looking for just two conferences that are international, always good, IAC, International Astronautical Congress, and Coast Bar. Those are always too good.
Well, don't forget, and again, educators, an easy kind of gateway into this would be the HICE. But the last conference I think we really need to mention is the one that you worked. You mentioned Kevin Johnson earlier that you started, and it was a small set education conference. Right? Absolutely.
So having gone to small sat and really learned a lot to help us get our CubeSat program started, which is now the Wolfpack, it's hard to get to Logan. You fly into Salt Lake City, you drive 90 minutes north. For years, there wasn't enough lodging and it was just expensive from the East Coast, especially for students. So my thought is, why can't we have a CubeSat conference on the East Coast at Kennedy Space Center?
Yeah.
Fantastic. And that's exactly what we did.
Yeah.
So we had 288 people register. And what our goal was to make this thing as helpful and as least burdensome for teachers and students as we could.
Yeah.
So teachers and students did not have to pay. We charged a very low rate for exhibitors. We ended up in a day and a half with at least 240 in person and then others online, but we had 24 presentations over a day and a half. And what's nice is if you came to our conference, then you were in the park for free. So that's a $75 ticket to tour KSC.
Well, we did the whole podcast with you about that. We also podcasted Kevin Johnson, but then the keynote speaker was Jen Kang. We've also podcasted.
Jen Kang runs the CubeSat program at the Naval Academy. He was there at the time the CubeSat was created. He was a student of Bob Twiggs at Stanford. The coolest thing I'll say about the conference, or one of the nice takeaways, is all of our conference presentations are on our Aerospace and Innovation Academy YouTube channel. There's a separate playlist, and they are organized into 7 videos that are about an hour each. So the 24 talks are divided into 7, sort of sections that you can easily watch, and we appreciate if you want to see it. We are planning 2023's conference, and the website is smallsateducation.org. It'll be 28 and 29 October. We had almost 30 people volunteer to be on our committee. So we're actually having a kickoff meeting in 2 days to get our volunteers working on next year's conference.
Well, listen, we've taken up a lot of this time revisiting, but that's just no wonder I feel like I've aged in this process. That's a lot of material. But I think, when I look back on it or I hear it again, kind of in this shortened version of all of that, the takeaway that I get, of course, is the opportunities that our students have, because as educators, right, it's rewarding when we get to go and present and all of that, but knowing that these kids are building resumes that are helping them to stand out, and they're doing the real world work. We say it all the time of aerospace in different areas, not just building the satellites, but they're writing about it and they're presenting about it and they're developing companies based on it, writing books on it. It's become really rewarding to see what's happening with these students. So, and you should be congratulated on the fact that you've been able to do that.
We have a good team, right? You and I work well on a number of things, maybe not always without some friction, but we get a lot of stuff done. I want to do a shout out and encourage any teacher or student that wants to do something like this. Just find us. Our emails are out there. Come to our YouTube, blog, webpage, podcast. Just find us and reach out, and we'll be glad to work with you in any way we can.
We'll do a few of those. Our website, Aerospace High, AEROSPACE High, HIGH.org. You'll see a lot there. We have a student who's working on maintaining that now as well. Another way we get our students involved. And of course, you'll find the blogs there that Kevin mentioned that Amanda does as well. And in addition, if you're looking for us on social media, Facebook, you can just go to space. That's GO, the number 2 space, and you'll find us there. Most of our information is posted there because, we're old. Facebook, right? But we are on Instagram as well. And we do have a monthly newsletter. If you're interested in hearing more about us, just go to our webpage and sign up for that. Kevin, is there anything we left off before we leave?
LinkedIn. I like LinkedIn. We post on LinkedIn and Twitter. So we have, find me on one of these social platforms, or find Shauna and just let us know. And
we'd be happy to work with you. But not just that, if you know of somebody who would be a good fit for this podcast, right? A phenomenal aerospace educator, someone who is in the industry, someone in STEM.
Or just someone excited to be in STEM.
Yeah. Yes. So we look forward to that, because we're, as we are now at our 100th episode, we are definitely ready to keep this going. We like it, and we need some new material. So anything else, Kevin, or
it's nice to get some feedback that some of you have really enjoyed some of the episodes.
Before we go, remember that podcast we did where we got somebody, that was Joe Blasberg, and all of a sudden somebody was listening and then contacted him from another country.
Yes.
Very
quickly, there was our college counselor where we work. We interviewed him, and someone that had lost contact or was able to reconnect with him, having heard his
podcast. Who knew? We're being followed. Anyway,
yes,
guys, we appreciate you listening to the podcast, sharing, liking, subscribing, all of those great things. But we hope that you'll join us again, of course, next week with our 101st episode, when we say, let's go to space.